tell me where the Ambassador Hotel is? I thought it was on this block, and I don't recognize it.
We welcome you once more to one of our Friends of the Forum's afternoon talks. Today we're very pleased to have Professor Tonsing of the Music Department to come to talk and do other kinds of things for us. I can't help but, I usually just say, here he is, but I can't help but take this one moment, since we have a public audience, to applaud and laud Professor Tonsing for his recent magnificent achievement, as far as I was concerned, of composing the music to Midsummer Night's Dream, the Town Theater play. Some of you have heard it, and if you haven't, you really missed something. I wrote him a note about it and said I hope he gets the contract when they do the next movie version of it. He can do the score of it. Anyway, he is going to talk to us today on his reflections on Crystallization 12-tone toy piano blues.
Thank you. I'm not at all sure about the philosophical contents of what we're about to do, but here goes. I want to thank you for this opportunity because this piece means a great deal to me. It is where various planes of existence came together and collided and produced something that to me is sort of a signpost. In some ways a tombstone, but mostly a signpost. And since it involves several planes of existence, what I'd like to do today is explore those planes of existence with you. And that way I think you'll understand how the various things fit together, and you might enjoy this sort of music a little bit more. It's a different kind of music. I'll play first the piece so you can get an idea of what it sounds like. And then I would like to talk about its background, which is the largest part of what I'll talk about. It has quite a background, the motivation for writing it, and why I chose this strange instrument, and something about the structure of the piece. The former part of the lecture will close with Gwen Powell joining me for a related work, actually sort of a spin-off work to this, a new thing. And then we'll open the floor for any contributions that you all would like to make, which should be interesting. I'll let you close the lecture. But first, here's Crystallization, Requiem for a Shoebox, Opus 62. Sorry, you can't read that. First, a few comments about the background of the piece. When I first began teaching, I was immediately alarmed and concerned about a high percentage of really motivated and bright students that failed my music theory classes. I felt horrible because I felt it must be in some way my fault. And so I interviewed all of them. And after interviewing them, I discovered something most peculiar. Their major should probably have been rock and roll. But there was no such thing as a rock and roll major. And so what they were doing is they were trying to learn something from classical music which perhaps they could apply to the field in which they had an interest. But it wasn't working. And it wasn't working because they were really unprepared to major in the music of what was truly a foreign culture. I could identify with that. And for a peculiar reason, when I entered college, I was familiar with Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert, Mahler, all the romantic and normal composers. And I entered a class called Music Literature, and I thought, well, this won't be too bad because my background isn't that bad, and I should be able to understand what they're doing. And the first thing the man pulled out was pre-Renaissance music, which of course I'd never heard, and he put on a recording of pre-Renaissance music, and it sounded like pure gibberish. I didn't understand it at all. It was just totally strange to me, and I didn't know what to make of it. Fortunately, after listening to it quite a bit and participating in something they had at KU, which was really wonderful, they had an ensemble of ancient instruments, so that for 2 years I was allowed to play viola da gamba in an ensemble that played music with ancient instruments, and I got to play the music. Playing it, of course, made a big difference, and I ended up loving that music very much. In fact, missing it a great deal. I almost thought for a while that playing old music on viola da gamba was something with my name written on it, but I guess not. But at any rate, I learned to love that music. The instructor of that was also an avid ethnomusicologist, and so in music literature we were exposed to music of foreign cultures, and again, a lot of it was gibberish to me. But I worked in the listening lab and was in charge of, in fact, the records which the students in that class were supposed to listen to, so I got to hear them quite a bit. And after repeated listening to field recordings of this music from other cultures, I began to identify very closely with some of the sounds, and I began to perceive great depth to that music and great power, so that the overall effect was really rather ear-opening. The man himself, bless Dr. Smithers, wherever he is now, taught us to have an open heart and an open mind to music with which we were unfamiliar. And I think that's one of the most valuable things I learned in my freshman year, because from then on, I've been constantly exposed to music I didn't understand at first, and because of my training and because of the experiences I've had with unfamiliar music, I've been able to finally be able to get into almost any type of music, which is nice. But this particular attitude from my training at University of Kansas helped me, because when I was confronted with these pseudo-rock majors, I say pseudo because there was no such major available, I was able to identify with their confusion, because I myself had been extraordinarily upset and confused by music literature class at the beginning. And I was also able to keep from judging their music, from passing judgment on it. It was music they loved very, very much, and I refused to judge it because I really didn't know enough about it to judge it. By the end of the 1960s, this particular type of student began to appear in increasing numbers, in fact, alarming numbers. At one time, when I first came here, I could count of our 120 music majors, 33 whose major, they had told me, would have been rock and roll had there been such a major, or popular music had there been such a major. To me, that was an alarming percentage of students. They did not open up to all of their teachers, and for a good reason, perhaps. I was concerned about the problem then. I had not, and still to this day, have no solution for it. But I was concerned about it, and so I wrote to former colleagues that were teaching all over the place and working all over the place, and one of them responded in a way that absolutely electrified me. This was Leon Hilmer, and Leon Hilmer is now a vocal coach and I guess you call it a chorus master at the New York City Opera right now. And she's quite skilled. And she responded to my anguished letter with an album. When I wrote to her, she was working in Washington, D.C., and some some actor friends of hers took her to hear a young lady, a young singer, and introduced her, who had just issued an album. Leanne listened to the album and immediately sent it to me. And she sent the album with the comment that it was a bit like Schubert. I listened to the album. It was quite like Schubert. And what was horrible, there goes my early prejudice, the songs were all by a lady. Well, you know, there hadn't been that many classical composers who were ladies. But here was a lady who could certainly write. And furthermore, she played all the instruments except one on the album. And furthermore, she wrote the poetry, and the poetry was excellent. And she even painted the album cover. And to top it all off, she sang the songs beautifully. I was absolutely floored. And it was very clear to me from the very first sounds that Joni Mitchell was indeed a very large talent with excellent possibilities for her future. Time has indeed shown this judgment of mine to be accurate. Every year she brings forth new artistic products, and each year she increases in stature and she increases in her artistic skills. She is an extraordinarily profound writer and performer. And I think there is no question now in anybody's mind that she is a verified genius. Well, Joni was a bit of a problem, an enormous problem to me, because recognition of high quality in popular music was totally against my entire training. My training had been totally in classical music, and I had assumed, as along with all my other training, that actually classical music was the best type of music, and particularly in popular music, there could not be any quality. But there was Joni. And what could I say? She was of excellent quality. And then, to top it off, my wife bought for me for Christmas an album by the Beatles. And at that particular point, they were concerned with some compositional problems that I was working on exactly at the same time. And irritatingly enough, their solutions to those particular problems were excellent. And they worked. And they were inventive. And I loved it, and I was mad. But they were certainly excellent. And so what could I do? My training taught that this music could not be excellent. And yet here I had Joni and Paul and John and Ringo and George. And I said, good grief, what am I going to do? How am I going to solve that? So immediately, of course, I thought about it and spent quite a number of years thinking about it. And I don't know really any nice way of saying this because it doesn't sound very nice, but it was true of me too, so I can talk about my guilt. If you want to project it to yourself, that's your problem. But I decided that my difficulty was that I had a class bias. Classical music had been associated with people who could afford it. when you use instruments that are works of art, a piano that is built with great, great care by the best makers in the world, or a violin that is a work itself, a work of art without even producing any sounds, it takes money. It takes money to support arts, as our nation has not yet found out. But I think the thing was that popular music was associated with inferior classes. And since it was associated with inferior classes, of course, their music would be inferior without question. The only difficulty was there was Joni and Paul and John and all the rest. What was I to do with them? What I did was say, thank goodness for ethnomusicology. Ethnomusicology taught me not to judge music of a culture until I could judge it from the viewpoint of that culture. I didn't know enough about it. So I decided that I would try. I would try to learn a little bit more about it so that perhaps I could clear up this confusion in my mind, because truthfully, I was extraordinarily confused about, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I have no taste. Maybe it's really horrible and I think it's wonderful, and that means that my taste is not very good. I didn't know what to do. So I decided to study it a bit. And I had at that time a string bass major who was one of the quasi-rock majors named Bob West. And Bob said, we just had a session in which he'd been accompanied by a pianist, and I coached them. And he said, why don't you come and coach our band? And I thought, well, I could try. So I coached their band, and later he talked me into playing with that band during one summer. And I played with the band during the summer, and good grief, what an education that was. It was very interesting, but I still didn't know enough. So the next fall, I started recording local bands all over town. When I heard of a band that was performing, I would go with my tape recorder, and I would set up microphones and record it and take it home and pore over those tapes and try and take them apart and find out how in the world this music was put together, what it was about, and whether it was any good at all. At one instance, when I was recording at one of the local hot spots, the lead guitar player of the group, who was a music major, said over the public address system to everybody, "Tonight we are being recorded by Shoebox Recording Studios." And then he referred to the fact that I didn't really have excellent equipment. I carried it in a box the way I usually do. I just had a shoebox and I carried my microphones in it. And so he dubbed the studio Shoebox. That is how my future recording studio got its name, as a joke. That's all right. A year later, I still didn't know enough, and so I took a year's leave of absence in which I played with 2 local bands, and I played cello and keyboards and synthesizer for a year. I returned to teaching with great relief. Teaching and the ordered life of school was a return to absolute sanity because, frankly, folks, I was totally out of my element. Now I know lots more, and I figured out what was actually going on some of the times when I didn't know what was going on. I don't think I'd return to that ever, but it was an excellent educational method, and I would recommend it to anyone who wanted to learn what was going on. But when I returned to teaching, my superior assigned me to teach jazz appreciation, about which I knew nothing, because in his words, it's all the same. So once again, I had to learn several foreign languages. I thought at first I would be only learning one, but it didn't turn out to be one. It turned out to be several, because jazz itself is an evolutionary art, and it's gone through so many violent changes that it has become several arts. At the time, I was just flabbergasted. I had to become a 90-day wonder in jazz, and I didn't know how to do it, but fortunately, jazz is one field about which there's been a lot of research in it, and a lot of excellent books have been written about it. And furthermore, there were excellent compilations of recordings of masters, and I studied it, and I'm so thankful that I had to do that, because from that, my perspective has been enormously enlarged, and I think the viewpoint is one of the most valuable things I gained. In the meantime, I moved to the country, and I moved there for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons was to avoid the constant interruptions of city life. It seemed like every time I'd write a note, someone would knock on the door. When I moved out to the country, 25 miles away, nobody knocked on the door. I could write 2 notes or something. Now I wrote lots more. But one of the most important reasons was that when I moved to the country, I surrounded myself with an ambience of silence. We all take these sounds for granted, and unfortunately, if you're in music, that means that you must train yourself to cut out those sounds. You must close your mind to all these sounds occurring around you, or you go nuts. Unfortunately, this carries over when you play, and I wanted to get out to the country where I could be surrounded by silence and let my ears come back to normal. Unfortunately, when I was in rock, my ears suffered greatly, and I'm fairly sure that they suffered damage. But being in the country has allowed me to maintain a certain amount of sensitivity in my ears, and I'm very thankful for that. But the entire time I was doing this, I was carrying on my usual career, full-time career in classical music, and only occasionally learning something about rock. It wasn't full-time. I had also, when I took that first summer out to play with Bob West Band, started playing in a recording studio. And that was the beginning of another side career of playing in studios. I go again this Monday. It's been continuing ever since. It's an interesting education, but something I dare not go into too deeply because it's a totally different world in a studio, a totally different world. But I dreamed of owning my own studio. So shortly after I moved to the country, I did it. I was driving home from Topeka, Kansas in the rain, and I said, well, here I am, wanting a studio so badly, I could always go to the bank, arrange a loan, and get one. And so I did. I went to the bank, I arranged for a loan, and surprisingly enough, they said, okay, and I ordered my small studio and put it in my house. Eight months later, it was stolen. Alas, nothing was insured, and the payments for it continue to this day and will for quite a bit of time now. It was stolen. And to me, that was the destruction of one of the most important dreams I ever had. I was a writer, and I wanted to be able to work directly with sound on tape. I wanted the education because to me, a studio was an enormous education. And there it was gone, and there'd be no way of replacing it. Just before the studio had been ordered, I'd had some sketches, actually the first 16 measures of this piece, which amazingly enough, except for one note, was not changed at all in the final composition. I'd started this, I'd sketched 16 measures. And after the studio was stolen, about a year later after I sketched this, I picked it up again, and the sketch was enormously attractive to me. For several reasons. First of all, it did express sorrow. And at that point, I felt great sorrow. It was a natural way for me to let out my sorrow in a constructive instead of a destructive manner. And also, it was for an instrument that had only 25 notes and cost about that many dollars. You didn't need expensive equipment to create art. And one of the things I needed proof of was the fact that although the studio was gone, although my dream of dreams was gone, creativity wasn't. One can be creative with nothing, almost. One of my inspirations was at that point a recording I had of an Indian musician who was born in the streets, and he became one of the master musicians of his area. And his instrument was tambourine. It's the only instrument he could afford. It only had one jangle on it. But on that instrument, he had an enormous palette of tonal color and an enormous, in fact, ferocious technique. So much so that one of his most popular duties is to be engaged in duos, in which a regular drummer with complicated tabla or one of the other drums will play a passage, and he will play it exactly back at that instant on tambourine. He's an enormously talented musician and really a great talent. And that was inspiration to me. If a tambourine was indeed a viable musical instrument, a work of art, why not a toy piano? The toy piano, however, did pose a problem because I was worried that it was a bit too limited. So before I started going too much further, I made sort of a catalog of for myself of the possible sounds that occurred on it. And this is a catalog of all the separate sounds that you can get on toy piano. By separate sounds, I mean just one sound. And this is a catalog of them. There are 25 notes. So, of course, of single pitches, there are 25 single pitches. But the amazing thing of two notes at the same time, there are 300. There are 300 two-note combinations. Of that, there are 2,300 three-note combinations and 12,649 three-note combinations, four-note combinations. Good grief. Just for a choice of the first sound, I had several thousand possibilities I could choose from. And for every sound in the piece, I would have thousands of choices. The instruments wasn't that limited, and it made me think, this is a toy? We certainly are an intelligent race if we give our youngsters toys that have that many possibilities on it. It's amazing to me. So I then took a look at my sketch with a lightened heart, saying, yes, it might be possible to write a large-scale piece. This instrument, however, is limited. As far as volume is concerned, you heard, it doesn't have a wide range of loud and soft. And furthermore, the instrumental color is limited to one color. But I thought that with melody and harmony and rhythm, I could achieve enough contrast to perhaps write a large-scale piece. It seemed to me possible, and this piece was to try and prove that. I then took a look at the sketch and looked at the first four notes. Already with the first four notes, the indelible blues character of this piece was immediately apparent, both melodically, harmonically, and rhythmically. It was definitely blues. So what the first thing I did is, then I thought, now I must clear my head and think exactly what is blues. Well, blues were totally appropriate because they traditionally expressed an individual personal lyrical reaction to a harsh reality whose beat went on and on and on. They were a product of a people who were trapped into not necessarily a very happy existence. And it was their expression their reaction, their creative reaction to their sad lot. And I could, with the destruction of really, truthfully, the most important dream I ever had, I could identify with that. I was trapped. The blues originally were improvised. I would not want to write an improvised piece. Of course, I decided this would merely be a classical version of blues. But the blues framework provided everything I needed. The framework itself provided the entire length of the piece. But first, I want to talk about the blues framework. Here is the harmonic structure of traditional blues. Now, traditional blues has 12 important beats, or 12 measures. And of those measures, they are divided into 3 phrases. Those 3 phrases only use 3 chords. The first phrase uses just a single chord, a chord built on the first note of the scale. If this is our scale, the blues progression for the first phrase only uses the 1 chord for 4 important beats. For the next phrase, it has a bit of contrast. For the first 2 measures of the next phrase, it uses a chord built on the 4th note of the scale for 2 measures, and then it returns to the first chord, a 1 chord, for the last part of the second phrase. The third phrase has the most density because it has a different function for every beat. There's a new chord on the first beat of the third phrase, a 5 chord, followed by the second. At any rate, I decided that the structure of the blues itself would be an appropriate structure for the entire piece. This harmonic structure actually did imply a very large structure. I thought that taking the 12 measures of blues, I would enlarge that to have 12 choruses, or 12 large phrases. There would be 12 of these things. And the relationship of those 12 would be governed by the same relationship that governed the measures in one blues chorus. The first 4 variations then would be linked in a unified whole over the same types of material. For the next 2 variations, they would be over contrasting materials. The next 2 variations will return again to materials from the very beginning, and the last 4 variations would all be highly contrasting. The 4th from the end would be the most contrasting of all of them, using elements never used before in the piece. The next one will return to elements of the 5th and 6th variations, and the next to last variation will return to elements from the very beginning, and the very end of the piece, of course, would summarize the whole thing. In other words, the structure of one chorus became the structure of the entire piece. Well, that's 12 choruses, each 12 measures in length, dealing then with 144 measures. This is before I'd really written a note beyond the sketch. I knew that the piece would be 144 measures. I thought perhaps there might be 1 or 2 measures at the end, and of course I was right. I added 1 more measure at the end. So before writing the piece, I knew that the piece would be about 145 measures in length. The relationship of 4 measure phrases and a chorus length of 12 measure and an overall length of 12 times 12 amused my creative child to no end. In fact, I remember when I realized that I just burst out laughing because the next opus number that was due was 62. And as you know, 6 times 2 is 12. It all seemed to work out. Everything was coming out 12s. Is that a bit like craps? I hope not. In addition, the harmonic structure of the sketch that I had made used 12-tone technique. It was all happening. And 12-tone technique uses all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. Good grief, 12? What's significant about 12? Something must go on about that. I have no idea, but 12 is the ruling number of this piece. The use of 12-tone technique originally demanded that you use all 12 notes of the scale equally and none be repeated until all of the other 11 had appeared. Well, that to me was a rule to be totally ignored, and the reason I ignored it was a historical reason. The original reason that rule was devised was to establish and give validity to atonality. And the validity of atonal works had been established many years ago. I didn't need to prove that atonal music was valid. It had been proven many times over. So I used 12-tone technique, of course, in my own way. I couldn't use, in this work, although there is one work in which I tried and it was not finished, I couldn't use it in the traditional means because it had nothing to do with my compositional technique. My compositional technique is definitely additive. I prefer starting with a few notes to which the other notes are added, and this is the manner in which I use 12-tone technique. I start with a few notes, and I add a few others, and I'd like to show you. Do you know, I think, actually, I've skipped something, but I'll get back to it. This is the very first variation. And in it, I would like to show you, it will illustrate my use of 12-tone technique. I've numbered first all the notes of the scale in the order in which they appear. The first note to appear is note number 1. So the very first phrase, or the very first measure, gives you the very first melodic idea. The first melodic idea is a single note, E. That's the first part of the melody. Answering that is a device in jazz known as a riff. A riff is a short fragment which is like a chorus, or more like a Poe's poem. In Poe's poem, The Raven, you know that word nevermore that occurs in each, well, that's sort of what a riff is. A riff is a constantly reoccurring short refrain. And the refrain is 4 notes. 3 notes. So you have, in the first measure, 4 notes. First, a lyrical note, followed by a 3-note refrain. That 3-note refrain, by the way, occurs in 86 measures of this piece. It is there through most of the piece. And again, its use is structurally quite necessary. It is my response to the situation. To show you my additive technique, I then took that first note in the second measure here, and I added 1 note in front and one note behind it. So you start off with to which is added one note in front and one note behind. The next measure adds another note in front of that, and the fourth measure completes this with one more note at the end. Can you hear it? It's one note, to which is added, to which is added, to which is added. And so the very first four measures actually form organically a single unit. They are related by this additive measure technique. The next phrase begins with a note not included at the beginning. It begins with another single note, A flat, to which is added in the next measure a pickup note to it. And in the next measure, those two notes become pickups to the original E that started the piece. A return to the one chord, if you remember. This first part was all one thing. The second phrase had two contrasting things, then returned to the beginning. This returns to the original note. And then you get a repetition of the end of the very first phrase. The third phrase starts with something completely different. The last two notes of the chromatic scale that I had not used, followed by these two notes from the second part, followed by a return to the note at the beginning. And the last measure, the turnaround, is sort of like a play thing. When you walk into play, it lists the characters in order of appearance, and that's what this does. The last measure gives you the names of the cast in order of appearance. Those are the notes of the cast in order of appearance. And you can see now what I mean by an additive technique. I generally use 12-tone in my own personal way. I wouldn't use it according to a textbook because I'm not out to write textbook music. And so I use it in a way in which the notes are started and then added to. And that's what I mean by an additive technique. Although this row of 12 pitches could be started on any pitch, giving you 12 related rows, or played backwards, giving you 12 more related rows, or inverted, that means all the intervals turned upside down, giving you 12 more rows, or played backwards and inverted, giving you 12 more rows. Although there are 48 related rows related to these 12 notes, I decided to use only 3 of those 48 rows. And the reason I wanted to use only 3 was blues only use 3 chords. If blues could be eloquent with 3 chords, I could certainly try with 3 rows. At any rate, this additive technique of melodic structure also decided the structure of the entire work. You can see where the 3-note riff occurs. It recurs almost exclusively in the first half, and then in the 2 variations associated with, in one variation associated with the return, plus the coda. Single note is the riff, or the thing in a single cluster. But we start with a solo melody, the melody I just played for you. The second variation is a variation of that, and it is in hymn style, 2 notes per time, a duet. You can hear that. The next variation has another duet, but instead of all the duet notes occurring at the same time, it has a little bit more individuality. Etc. The fourth variation is actually a canon, in which one voice gives something and it's immediately followed by the same voice giving the same tune. Is followed by only at the same time. In other words, the very beginning of this all uses the very beginning of this all uses materials related to that. For the second 4 variations, I decided to add a bass part and to bring out the jazz character of the piece even more, and I did. And we have and that bass part is there. The next variation, which is related to that, is a duet over the bass parts. And where in the world is it on this music? Okay. 2 notes over that. Then after that, returns to single sounds, as in here, but this time the sounds continue without stop. After that is followed a canon related to this canon somewhat, but the notes are not stopping, constant eighth notes, etc. This is followed by a variation which is a parody of Casey Would Waltz with a Strawberry Blonde, and the band played on. The blonde, to which that refers, of course, is Beth. Beth had been my best friend during almost all of the acts of this tragedy, or comedy, or I think comedy now. She had witnessed most of the things that had happened, and including playing with bands. I think that's how I first met Beth. She came to one of the band concerts and managed to have fun. And of course I was delighted with anybody that could have fun with that hideous music that I was trying to put out. That, it was pretty bad. I think the thing I did worse was rhythm in rock. It took me the longest time to get so I fitted. It seemed like every time I played, I stuck out like a sore thumb. I tried to play invisibly. That helped. But at any rate, this variation is a little bit about Beth, and it's a parody of Casey Would Waltz with a Strawberry Blonde. You know, Casey would waltz with a strawberry, etc. It's a takeoff on that tune, which is totally different. We haven't had a variation like that so far. Variation 9 returns to something like this, only it's in steady notes. Variation 1 right here, starting at measure 121, is returned to the elements in the beginning, in which the riff returns, but it returns in a disguised form. When I play, what is sounding is, but disguised. Here it is. Can you hear that riff pattern? It occurs, but it's constantly disguised. In other words, it's sort of returned to the beginning, but it's much faster now and much more disguised. The last variation is a bit of a self-portrait. It starts off with a parody of an aria by Leoncavallo, in which a clown bemoans his fate. That's me, folks. It's a bit melodramatic, but that's exactly the way I was feeling. And after that, the entire piece is closed with a riff, and the riff is now occurring in clusters. In other words, groups of note present the riff, and that's a nice conclusion to it. This all was decided, the structure of the piece was all decided before I added a single note to the sketch. And this comes from my composition teacher, Laurel Anderson, who believed that the first thing you do is you arrive at a sketch, or it happens. The next thing you do is you examine the sketch for the whole. The sketch, the knitted germs, in this point, the first 4 notes. The first 4 notes gives you the structure of the entire composition, and it did. I knew after studying the sketch and thinking about it exactly how the piece would go, which is what he taught me. And then only after every part of the piece is so clear that, in his words, it must be a single word, or it must be a single thought. You must be able to think of the piece in a single thought, as though all the details were there in a single thought. Only then do you begin writing. And maybe that's why I'm so slow, and maybe that's why I don't write as much as I'd like to. It's even that way with music I consider somewhat commercial music, like music for Lysistrata or music for Midsummer's Night's Dream. I don't seem to be able to break away from that technique, and before I can write a note of Midsummer's Night's Dream, I have a sketch, usually 4 or 5 notes, from which the entire fabric must be woven. And it gets pretty hairy because I'm almost got the thing pictured, and I can't wait to write it, and once it's pictured, I can write it. But that's the only way I really like to work. It's sort of an organic way of writing. And what it is you keep a constant picture of the whole thing in your head as you write, so that every element contributes to the structure of the whole. A part of the practice of doing this is I got in the habit many years ago of writing only on one side of pages, so that at any moment I could lay the whole thing out and see the whole thing in one glance visually. And while I was writing this piece, after I'd started writing it, the idea occurred to me that it would be very useful if I can indeed put it all on one piece of paper. And I tried. The first attempt was a bit impractical. I thought, now that won't fit on a music stand. It wasn't a very good idea, but I tried. And after that, of course, I arrived at the idea of putting it, instead of one chorus on every line, putting one phrase or four measure phrase on each line, and that's how we achieved the final shape of it. Its shape reminded me of a memorial stone, and that is exactly what this piece is. It is a tombstone. It is a tombstone for a dream that died. And that's why I like this shape, because to me that's what it is. After I wrote the piece, I actually thought for quite a while, and perhaps 6 months, that my career was over, that there was nothing more that needed to be written, that I had said everything that I had to say, and I really didn't want to go on very much. Creative energy continued with projects that I considered somewhat commercial, and I didn't know really how to react to the situation. But my irrepressible child immediately decided that crystallization was merely the 145th piece of 145 pieces for toy piano. In other words, the structure of one chorus became the structure of the piece, and now this piece is one measure in a large group of pieces. And so that they would have 3 groups of 48 pieces. The first 48 pieces would be an instructional method on toy piano consisting of music. The second 48 pieces would be arrangements of masterworks, and the third 48 pieces would be original works. Only the 48 arrangements of masters and a few of the original works are completed. As with so many ideas, crystallization is complete, but it's not complete. At least part of it's done. I don't know if the rest of it will ever get completed. If it does, fine. If it doesn't, fine. I now realize, however, that this experience of this piece, which to me was an end, was confused. Nature and life has a very frustrating way of confusing endings with beginnings. Every time I think something is ending, it's not an ending, it's a beginning. Oh, I see. And so life always seems to do that, and that's what happened with this. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning of something new. One more major work, and by the way, I use a criteria for works, which means the following. If most of the piece is classical, it gets an opus number. The piece with which Gwen and I will close this formal part has no opus number because, of course, the piece is mostly popular. And the Opus 62 has now been followed by an Opus 63 of the summer that is yet unperformed, that perhaps next year will be performed, and sketches are already brewing. To me, writing is like gardening. You put sketches there and they start to grow, and you tend them, and you also leave them alone. You have to leave plants alone. You can't mess with them too much or they'll die. And so I have watered those sketches a little bit and backed away from them, and some of them are sprouting, and so I think perhaps crystallization is a beginning, not an end. This fall, I was notified while writing the first notes of the play for Aristophanes music, I was notified by phone that Bob West, my best friend from those early days, was killed. And I had 2 weeks to write the score, so there was no way to put aside it and deal with grief. Instead, I had to write that minute. And so my creative child immediately outpoured this piece, which I thought would be horribly sad. I was afraid that I couldn't use it because I was really devastated by it. But amazingly enough, the piece turned out to be very joyful, very pleasant, all that. I will never to this day understand how come it turned out pleasantly. It doesn't make sense to me. But then I only work here. Whatever it says to do happens, and I don't have to understand how it come it turned out pleasantly. You know, you do what happens, and that's what happened. At any rate, it is fitting to close this lecture with a performance of this piece because, truthfully, if that string bass student, who was a quasi-rock major, hadn't pushed me into coaching his band and joining and all this sort of stuff, none of this or Crystallization, of course, would ever have been written. And here's a piece then in memory of Bob West, who lived from 1948 to 1979, and Gwen Powell will join me. And I hope she brought my music. Good. This is called Rag in Memory of Bob West. to any inputs you would like. So let's hear from you. This
may be a question that's just tangential to all you said, which was what I thought. But at the end, when you talked about the difference between reading opus number and classical music, and how you establish the difference between those two, since you already told us earlier that there's an awful lot of very important compositional problems, similarities between popular music and classical music.
difference is in intent. And the intent of an opus number is to say, particularly to classical musicians, this is a work by which I am willing to be judged. This work is an organic part of the body of the work, which supposedly represents my creative side. And this one can be judged as part of the whole, and it can be, in fact, in some molecular way, the whole thing. Well, as much as I've studied this, popular music is still a foreign language. And it would be like Loki writing poems in English. If you know what I mean. Of course, there's Joseph Conrad, who started writing in English when he was 40-some years old, so I don't know. But for me, I don't think I would give a opus number, which is directed at classical audiences, to a work that is primarily popular and whose intent is more popular. I would never give an opus number to this work. This is an extra work of something. Mitch? So I saw one hand behind yours. Yes, Mitch. Yeah. How do you accommodate Oh, they exist not perhaps as in many numbers as during the late 60s. I have no solution. The newspaper article which appeared last weekend, I'm afraid to say, although the reporter's heart was in the right place, is a work of fiction. I was quoted as saying things on subjects we did not even discuss. And unfortunately, she guessed wrong on some of them. One of them, the subjects on which I was quoted, which I did not say, was that I found that there was no relationship between classical music and rock that would benefit a rock person from studying classical music. That is not true. Most of the most gifted rock people I have known have been somewhat ethnomusicology people, and they have learned a great deal from classical music. In fact, two of our previous majors, Steve Allen and Ron Flynt, both of whom signed a $250,000 contract with Columbia Records this fall and are now on tour with a band called 2020 and doing very well. Both of them benefited very highly from a study of classical music theory, and they told me so. I think if one were a rock major, or one wanted to be such a thing, one would study classical music because that is what is available. It is very well documented. It's very well studied. One could go to college and benefit from an enormous number of courses. So one could go to school. The only difficulty is declaring a major. That would be an area of difficulty. I don't know how to solve it, but unfortunately my concern is merely teaching theory classes in private cello. I am fortunately not an administrator, for which I thank my lucky stars every day when I see the problems they have to deal with. I don't have to deal with that, but occasionally I've had to deal with friends that have asked me what to do, and I say the same thing to them as I say to myself: seek knowledge wherever you can find it. And you'll be able to find some knowledge in college, which of course will be useful. And particularly so if one's a keyboard player. In other words, classical music has studied keyboard techniques so well that one cannot help but improve study of classical keyboards. One cannot help but improve one's keyboard technique. There are things that can be studied in college, but Mitch, I don't know. The jazz people that I've talked to, Billy Taylor's a well-known jazz figure, and I got to talk to him about 3 days. And I talked to him about this problem, and he said, well, you know, in jazz, the best study is to go and study the recordings of the great masters and try to do it. Try to do what they're doing. In the jazz, he felt playing was the school. And he felt that you should go to a jazz center and study jazz by playing it, getting in a group with some older musicians and having them help you. Nowadays, one can even study jazz at North Texas and other places, so there are options open. But for rock people, there are few options open, I'm afraid. For legitimate study, it would be nice if there would be a place, but I myself would be very hesitant to devise a course for them because I'm a classical musician. It would take a very knowledgeable rock musician in order to set that up. I don't think I could. I don't think I could with success. I don't know. Do you have any suggestions as to what they should do? I don't know. Yes? Yes. I might make an enemy or two here. But it seems like jazz was only acceptable to universities when it was dead. And perhaps when rock dies, it will be a fit subject for us to then break down into component parts and teach those skills. I would hate to see that happen. And by the way, I don't really think jazz is dead at all. I think it's in a slightly dormant stage. It's changing wildly. And although there are a number of people that might disagree with me, I think that the fusion movement has a great deal of promise. I think the vitality of Mr. Correa and Mr. Hancock creatively proves that there's still life in the old goat yet, even though it's now got a new color. Psychedelic, perhaps. Anyone else? Any comments? Anything to share?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.